Nick. So Nick, the floor is all yours today.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. And can everyone see my screen right now? All right, I'll be careful what I put up there. I want to thank again the Flood Advisory Board for all the hard work over the past year. I know we have these conversations about once a year with regard to the new flood maps and also what the borough is doing right now in its efforts in floodplain management. But I would be definitely remiss if I didn't congratulate the FAB, the borough, and the NOEM for all the hard work over the past year. It definitely paid off yet again with CRS. And with that, I will get right to it. So tonight's presentation is on the implications of the revised flood insurance rate, flood insurance studies, the revised flood insurance rate maps, but also other things that are going on in the world of floodplain management. And before I get too far into the weeds, I do want to go over some of the basic terms, because my presumption is always that, we've been looking at this for so long, we all know everything, but I think it's good sometimes to jump back and do a little bit of the basic housekeeping on as to what all this stuff means, and FEMA versus DEP and what they regulate, and again what the implications are to the homeowners and businesses within Pompton Lakes. So with that, I'll segue right into it. As everyone is aware, on April 17th, or maybe not, on April 17th, 2020, we being Passaic County, got new flood insurance rate maps and flood insurance studies. And I'll go into it a bit, but there were changes to the floodplain, which is the 100-year regulated area, but also the floodway. And the floodway expansion in Pompton Lakes was pretty substantial. So just a couple quick terms, because I'm going to be saying FIS and FIRM or FIRM. FIS is the flood insurance study. FEMA, with their maps, releases a flood insurance study that explains the technology and the technical work that went behind the map production. The FIRM, or the flood insurance rate maps, are what we use as homeowners to figure out, where are we? Am I in zone X or zone AE? And we'll go over those terms as well. But the FIRM is the flood insurance rate map. Those are available online. They've made it, they being FEMA, have made it much easier to figure out what zone you're in and also how close that line is to your house, etc. And I'll go over that a little bit, where you can actually take a look at your flood insurance rate map, and people that may or may not be in can see how close that line is truly to their structure. Floodplain, there's about 1 million definitions. The most important are FEMA's, which are Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA, also known as the 100-year floodplain. Now there's the floodway. They're not interchangeable. Floodway we're going to talk about a bit. The floodway is the section of the watercourse. It's really the high velocity section. It's the river plus a little bit of the overbank, typically. And that is the area that DEP and FEMA most heavily regulate. Again, if there's a major flood event, that's the high velocity section of your river. It's not those overbanks with kind of the slow, gradual flows, or the larger, they call it the flood fringe. The floodway is the area, again, most regulated and with the high velocity flow. The flood fringe is the area between your floodplain. Floodplain are the only lines that FEMA really looks at when they're trying to figure out, do you require flood insurance? That's the floodplain. It's blue line to blue line. Within that, you've got the floodway. The area between the floodway and the floodplain is your flood fringe. Now, to make it more complicated, because that's not too bad, the New Jersey DEP has their own floodplain, not to be confused with the FEMA floodplain. And they call it the flood hazard area. Now you'd say, well, why do I care? Why does Nick always talk about such boring things? Well, it's because the flood hazard area is the area regulated by the DEP. So if you want to put on a deck, or put a swimming pool in, or put up a fence, or put an addition on your house, or redo your driveway, and you're in the floodplain, you are regulated by the DEP. But it's a DEP floodplain, or the flood hazard area. And I'll show you in a minute how you'd identify each of these. So again, FEMA, who govern flood insurance, regulate the floodplain. The DEP, who govern construction in New Jersey, have a flood hazard area. The flood hazard area in general is larger than the floodplain. And again, I'm going to show you a map of that. Lastly, because that's easy to keep up with, there's another one. There's a riparian zone. So you have the FEMA floodplain, which is insurance. You have the New Jersey DEP flood hazard area, which is regulation of construction. Then you also have a riparian zone. Now, riparian zone, we're not going to talk about much tonight, but what that really is the buffer area from top of bank of streams that are regulated as well. So before you do construction, you want to make sure you're not in a riparian zone. You want to make sure you're not in the FEMA flood hazard area. And the best way to figure that out is reach out to the construction code official or contact me when it comes to the borough. And I'm always happy to tell you, because like I said, it makes me feel good when people call me. So if you look at my screen, you'll see the channel and the riparian zone. And again, these have nothing to do whatsoever with the FEMA floodplain or the DEP flood hazard area.
Marie, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to make sure the riparian zone that you're mentioning, that's only a state requirement? That's not a federal?
That's a great question. It is a state only. Riparian zone is a definition that was created by DEP as part of the Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules.
Okay,
And again, that's for environmental protection,
Right.
and it has unrelated again to flood insurance or regulating what you can build and stuff like that. The riparian zone is an environmental area. It's a buffer around the rivers,
Okay,
and
thank
they
you.
go between 50 to 300 feet from top of bank. It depends on the categorization of the waterway and whether or not there's threatened and endangered species.
And that's done on individual waterways, depending on what you want to build.
Yes, the buffer size has nothing to do with the use. The buffer size is based on whether or not the waterway is for public drinking water or it's just it's a drainage ditch with 50 acres contributing to it, and also whether or not there's threatened and endangered species. That'll determine the buffer along. It has nothing to do with what you're building. Like if I'm building a supermarket, it doesn't make the buffer bigger.
Thank you.
Okay, now. Just so again, as we jump around, like this is a flood insurance study and this is a flood insurance rate map. This is what the first page of each look like. So on the left, you'll see the flood insurance study front page, which that's my reading. That's what I do for fun. And then on the right side, you've got the flood insurance rate maps. And the only thing that homeowners need to make sure they look at when they grab a map is on the bottom right that it says April 17th, 2020, because there's tons of the old maps floating around. You can even find the old maps online. So again, you want to make sure that you check what they call the panel date, and that the effective date is April 17, 2020. Now, again, I wanted to show you when you pull one of these maps, I'm going to show you how to look the maps up. When you grab one of these maps, these are the lines that we should all be interested in as a homeowner. Like I'll find my house and I'll say, okay, so I've got the NJ DEP flood hazard area, and that's like that black and white railroad track looking border. And that's the extent that the DEP regulates. So you'd say, well, where does my insurance requirement start? My insurance requirement starts at the bottom with the FEMA floodplain line. So that outside blue line, that's the insurance line. The railroad track line, that white and black line, outside that's the DEP regulated zone. Again, it has nothing to do with flood insurance. Your flood insurance line is your FEMA floodplain line. Now, for construction, you're like, well, what would really inhibit or prohibit my ability to construct? That's the floodway. That's that white hatched area. In this case, it's the Wanakee River. That white hatched area is the area that's hard to build in. So your floodway is the area where it's difficult to build. One thing I want to point out, the DEP and FEMA both use the same floodway. So if people are like, well, what's a DEP floodway? It's the same as the FEMA floodway. There's no difference. It's the floodplains that differ. You have a DEP floodplain, you have a FEMA floodplain, and you have a shared floodway. So far, so good. Moving along. Did the maps change? Okay. The last set of maps came out in 2007. And then in 2020, we got the new maps. The flood zone did not get much bigger. In fact, it only increased by about 0.3%. That is not a substantial increase. So the good news is the floodplain didn't become massive and suddenly pull people in and require flood insurance where it wasn't required before. However, the floodway got much bigger. So for those who already live in the floodplain, okay, it didn't get much bigger. For those of us who already live in the floodplain, there's a decent chance you got pulled into the floodway. And the reason that's so important for everyone on this call is because if you got pulled into, or your constituents got pulled into the floodway, there are now serious restrictions on what can be constructed. And according to our numbers, between 325 and 350 homes were pulled in. And just to give you just so you know, I'm not lying. If you look at the overlay, the blue are the old flood maps and the red are the new flood maps. And again, they didn't change all that much. The two overlays show not much difference. In fact, some areas actually got a little smaller. So in general, no major change to the floodplain. I'm not lying, it's true. Now, I get asked this is probably the most common question, actually the second most common question. The most common question is, how do I reduce my flood insurance, obviously. But the second most common question I get is, well, how can I definitively find my flood zone? And I'm going to throw a caution flag on this one, because there's a lot of web sources out there that'll tell you what your flood hazard is. They'll say, I'm high hazard or low hazard. The problem is, first of all, those websites are highly inaccurate. And second, they're only talking about your property boundary. They're not talking about your structure. And for flood insurance, we don't care about our flood, our lot boundary, because let's say you have a 25-acre property and a tiny house. Well, these websites, if you type in a property and that corner of that property touches a flood zone, they'll say, oh, you're high risk. So it's best to look at the FEMA Map Service Center site so you can actually see your house and say, does the line touch my house? Because the line doesn't touch my house, the line just touches my property, you have a good case for being removed from the flood zone. And again, I'm talking about your structure. So safest way is the FEMA Map Service Center, or by emailing me, because like I said, I love getting phone calls. It makes me feel like I'm important. And all you do on this one, and you can see on this is the website, MSC for mapservicecenter.fema.gov. It is a government site. They're not going to try to sell you anything. You type in your address in the address line, click search. And for those of you who've used this before, you'll recognize this. They've changed it a little bit, but for the most part, it hasn't changed all that much. And again, if you look, you can actually see your structure on the aerial. When you look at your structure, you start looking for lines. You've got the orange line, that's the 500-year. But again, you've got that blue area and the hatched area. The blue area is the floodplain. The hatched area, the red and blue lines, that's your floodway. All right. What you can do now is you can also click on the NFHL viewer, and that brings you into more of a Google or user-friendly environment, but it's the exact same map. It just gives you a slightly more, this is it right here, it gives you a slightly more friendly environment. It makes it easier to print them out and stuff like that if you want to copy for your records. So again, just to go back, you have the initial view, and then you have the National Flood Hazard Layer. And the National Flood Hazard Layer viewer, again, is just more user-friendly and can print out a nice copy of the map, especially if you're disputing your flood zone. All right. And just a quick reminder as to what these different zones are. If it says your zone X shaded, it's 500. Zone X unshaded, you're not in the flood zone. And predominantly in Pompton Lakes, our flood zone is what's called zone AE, which means that elevation has been established in the flood zone, which is why elevation certificates will work in the borough, because we have base flood elevations all over the place. And I'm going to show you an elevation certificate in just a minute. So a couple things about the floodway. Does your insurance go up cost-wise? No. Are there stricter standards? Yes. And that will impact anyone trying to do reconstruction, new construction, remodeling, etc. Because in a floodway, there's a lot of restrictions. And I say here, and I won't read the whole thing because you can take a look at your leisure, but development in a floodway is severely restricted. Typically, only development that is essential is permitted easily, like if you have to build a new bridge or that sort of thing. New buildings are predominantly prohibited in a floodway with minor exceptions. Again, typically any new building is prohibited in a floodway. I would say, can I build anything? There are certain kinds of fences you can build. There are certain kinds of swimming pools that are allowed. Above ground is almost never. Repaving is typically allowed with permit. Oh, when it says permit by rule, by the way, that means it's only the borough that needs to review it. There are no fees from DEP and there are no submission requirements to DEP. So anywhere where I'm calling out permit by rules, a PBR, as they're known, a permit by rule allows construction without a DEP permit. Again, you just have to submit it to the construction code official for review. General permit 5 allows for reconstruction or elevation of an existing building. This one's very important because what's not prohibited is if I want to rebuild my house in the floodway, They can't say, oh, no, you're not allowed to do that. I absolutely can fix up my house. There are just certain restrictions when it comes to how much money I put into the improvements without elevating it. But again, for the most part, you can redo your home in a floodway. Okay. So, or elevate it. You're allowed to elevate it as well.
Nick, I just want to, this is Lauren, just want to ask something real quick on that. So just to point of clarification for anyone who's listening, that when you say you can fix your house, what you mean is you can do a repair in kind, you can replace and repair something that's already there. My front steps need to be repaired. I can repair my front steps. I can't say, well, my front steps need to be repaired, so I'm going to build a front porch that's the whole length of the house instead and is larger than what was there. Is there that kind of differentiation that you're, yeah.
That's actually an excellent question. Yeah, pretty much what that means is you can't expand what we call the footprint. You know, you could rebuild your steps, but you couldn't build larger steps, meaning the footprint from looking down. You can't make the area bigger. You know, if you want to put a large porch on, it would be prohibited. And then with minor exceptions, I don't want anyone to think you can't do anything. It requires you to definitely check in with myself, talk to the construction code official, or you could even look at the DP land use has a cool site that's common project types, and it's actually it's pretty easy to check yourself as well. But I would say you have hold before you do any improvements in a floodway just to make sure it's not some sort of violation. Okay. And the other thing too is, and this is true of the floodplain and floodway, if you wanted to do any improvements to the structure that exceed 50% of the structure value, not the whole property, but the structure value, you'll likely have to elevate. So my other caution is that before you do a massive improvement in a floodplain or floodway, you know, the flood fringe or the floodway, you want to double check you're not exceeding 50% of the structural value, because then again, you fall into what's called a substantial improvement, and you'll have to elevate. All the entire structure would have to come to code, the current code. So great question, Laura. Thank you. Lauren, sorry. Okay, here are some no's. I'm just throwing out my no's. I'm kidding on a lot of these. Like it says, like no toys. Obviously, yes, there are certain things you can have, but for the most part, outdoor storage is prohibited. Any kind of outdoor structures expanding the footprint of your home are prohibited. Fill is a definite no-no in the floodway. Now, I've talked about a lot of the kind of the negatives, but what can we do? We're being told now what we can't do. What can we do? Well, the good news is that the actual extents of the floodplain haven't gotten all that much bigger. Also, because of the borough's hard work on the community rating system, the flood again this year, borough floodplain residents still pay the lowest non-coastal flood insurance in New Jersey. It's a 25% discount, which is fantastic. The FAB, the borough staff, you know, your clerk is so hardworking, Liz. You know, it's been a real home run. It's $265,000 off per year. It's about $500 per owner in the floodplain off flood insurance, which is phenomenal. Again, you're a voluntary member of the FEMA community rating system. You have been now since like 2009. You know, you guys have been awesome. And why? You know, what do we get the points for? Public outreach is top notch. Open space protection, the floodplain and floodway, phenomenal. Strict protection of the floodplain. Drainage system maintenance by DPW. Flood warning and response by your OEM. Continual support, you know, by mayor and council for constantly improving the program. Because every year we get new requirements, and every year Pompton Lakes jumps out and does them. So we've stayed in the good graces of FEMA now since 2009, 2010, and meticulous record keeping, because that's a big part of the program. So, you know, kudos to I know you guys hear me about all the time about CRS and the borough, but you're one of the first 5s in the U.S. east of the Mississippi, and you're still one of the only 5s that are non-coastal in east of the Mississippi. So kudos to Pompton Lakes. More good news. All right, right now, Lincoln Park, Pequannock, and Montville have now jumped into the game on fighting the floodway. So the floodway, while established by the effective maps, is still very much open because the Passaic River and the Pompton River are both being contested now by multiple towns, not just Pompton Lakes going it alone. And that effort, as an update, the floodway is currently being revised by FEMA in Morris County, and say, well, that's Morris County. Yeah, but we share a border along our rivers with Morris County. So on behalf of Pompton Lakes, I'm obviously keeping an eye on the changes to see if we can benefit from them as well. And that
Nick,
effort
just
is ongoing, and I'll get you an update as soon as I get one.
Nick, just to bring people to speed who don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry, Steve. Yeah, you might want to give them some backstory on that.
The backstory for that is that when the new maps came out, we all noticed that the floodway got really big. As Nick started, almost 350 homes added where the floodway was a lot smaller before. So it raised a few red flags that the borough and along with Nick have been investigating. And that's what the discussion of the town is addressing here.
We should probably also mention that the borough did appeal the maps in 2015, started an appeal process, a 2-year process, multiple engineers involved, multiple attempts. Our appeal was denied. We appealed the denial of our appeal and have gone through the process. So anyone who didn't move through that process with us or was not a resident or was not involved at that point in time, the borough absolutely tried to fight FEMA on this, and Nick was very instrumental in that also. Unfortunately, the Passaic County maps were accepted, adopted as they are. Our neighbors in Morris County are on a different timeline, and it's allowed them to come back again. So this is the second time the problems with the overall mapping of the Passaic River Basin have been called to FEMA's attention, and they're getting a little bit more traction. So it does open a door maybe to, well, nothing's ever really final.
No, but Lord, I will say this, because I got some very direct questions from the mayor and council. But what did we do differently? And the answer is nothing. We filed almost identical appeals in Lincoln Park, and I was the engineer involved for Pompton Lakes, Lincoln Park, Wattville, and now I'm retained by Pequannock to fight as well. And honestly, the basis of your appeal is quite similar. And so on the negative side, you're like, well, why didn't we get standing on a scientific review like the other towns did? Well, I look at it as a positive. It's like, well, look, if we win in Morris, then we come right back to Passaic, because again, the basis was almost identical in the different communities. So again, I'm putting my optimist hat on right now and say, hey, look, we're getting some traction right now with these 3 communities fighting together. So on behalf of the borough of Pompton Lakes, of course, I will take that information and apply it to Pompton Lakes as well. So we are far from dead in the water. We are far from dead in the water. I don't believe that at all. I think, and honestly, we'll fight this one until there's nothing left to fight. I just made engineering sound much more exciting than it is, but that part is exciting. Everything else is engineering. Now, so the borough is not alone in concerns over the maps. We went over that, but there are other ways to reduce flood insurance costs. Now, there's 3 that I want to highlight. There's private insurance, which is now approved in New Jersey, which I know a lot of people have at least looked into. I'm not acting as an advocate, and I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's another thing to look at. Again, private flood insurance. It tends to be less expensive. However, insurance providers that provide private flood insurance are not obligated to provide flood insurance. So they do base you on the risk that they perceive to their insurance firm. So something to note that insurance providers do not have to provide flood insurance. The National Flood Insurance Program does. Elevation certificates. I only bring these up every single time, but I always bring up elevation certificates because the default from your insurance provider is that you're high risk. But if you get an elevation certificate and find that your finished floor isn't inundated, only your basement, there are reductions in flood insurance that can occur. And when it comes to private insurance, they always want an elevation certificate because, again, they want to understand the risk to the policy provider, not just the policy holder. Okay. And I'm going to show you an elevation certificate and show you one. It's a real example of how it can be a huge win. The last one is a letter of map amendment. Now, remember I showed you I can look up your property. Well, let's say you look at it and say, oh, that's weird that the line hits my property. Yeah, but the line does not hit my home. The line's next to my home. That's called out as shown, AOS. You can actually go on the FEMA letter of map amendment portal and appeal it yourself. You don't need me. I can help you through it. And in 15 minutes, file an appeal and say, I'm out as shown. The line does not touch my house. here's a screen capture, look at the line, here's my house, here's the line, and then you'll get a LOMA, letter of map amendment, which when you provide it, send it to your insurance provider, you no longer have to pay flood insurance or your mortgage holder. So letter of map amendment, great one to remember. Another thing that I like is there's a free flood risk evaluator, and it was prepared by a private insurance company, but the risk evaluator itself is free. And it'll actually take an elevation certificate. Again, you have to have an EC, but it'll actually take an elevation certificate and tell you, A, is there a benefit to private insurance? But B, if you added flood, so let's say flood vents to your flood openings to your crawl space, would it significantly decrease your flood insurance? Is there anything you can do physically to the home to substantially reduce flood insurance? And I like that one because the answer often in areas with crawl spaces is yes. Now, let me talk to you about this flood elevation certificate. And I'll try to be brief, but that's typically not true because I talk a lot. So if you look at the flood elevation certificate, if you look at section B9, which is highlighted in red, you'll see the base flood elevation is provided. It's elevation 221, okay? Now, if you go down, you start looking at my list, it's like, okay, 221, top of my bottom floor, 222, okay, lowest adjacent grade, but wait a second. My bottom floor is above the base flood elevation. And because the bottom floor is above the base flood elevation, there's a substantial reduction in flood insurance. They're going to carry some because, again, water can still get to the structure itself. You see lowest adjacent grade, 212, highest adjacent grade, that's the soil around the house, 213. But there is, other than the staircases, the finished floor of the home, the first floor of the home is up and out. And again, this is an elevation certificate that paid off big time. This probably would take, I think it was like $2,100 insurance and made it like $400. So something to consider. Now, elevation certificates are something that you own. They're your elevation certificate. So you can look at it. If the engineer says this doesn't do anything for you, put it in a drawer. But if an engineer looks at your elevation certificate, or you look at your elevation certificate and say, I think this might be a win, show it to your flood insurance provider. You might obtain a significant reduction, especially if you're private insurance, because again, they go by risk. They go by perceived risk to the policy provider. And with that, I thank you for giving me 30 minutes, and I open it up to questions.
We do have one question from Bill Cunningham. He said, do you lose grandfathered benefits with FEMA insurance if you go with private insurance and decide you want to return to FEMA?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. Yes, you do. If you're currently what's called a preferred risk policy, stay there. That's a great question. Yes, stay with the preferred risk policy. If that preferred risk policy, if the grandfathering goes away and the flood insurance prices start going up, there's no benefit to staying. Jump to private. But no, that's a fantastic question, actually.
Maria, you got a question? Maria, you're muted.
I want to make sure she knows I'm not ignoring her. I just can't hear her.
I'm sorry, that better?
There
Okay.
you go.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I was on a DEP call on March 4th, model code coordinated ordinance. And I think you were on that call, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I thought I saw your name. I thought this was very complicated because it was a little confusing to me, but it seemed like if you wanted to update your house and you were in the floodway and you were going to do more than that 50% increase in value, and this would require you to raise your house.
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. And yeah, Maria, first of all, let me go back for a second because you're bringing up a really good question. Because as you very well know, a year ago, we had to redo all our model ordinances as required by FEMA and DEP. Borough Pompton Lakes did a great job, submitted DEP approval, and our flood control ordinances last year were approved. High five, borough, and we're done, right? Unfortunately, no. FEMA looked at the DEP ordinances and said these do not comply with the National Flood Insurance Program requirements, so we have to do them again. So I want to make sure the borough understands the borough did nothing wrong. The borough followed the DEP standard ordinances to the letter, made certain improvements because of our CRS standing, and got the seal of approval from DEP. When FEMA went in and audited all the towns, not just the borough of Pompton Lakes, they found that the DEP ordinances were unacceptable. And I am as annoyed, I think, as all the boroughs and municipalities in New Jersey that went through this rigorous process of updating ordinances as required, just have to go back and do it again. Maria, the good news is this: there are no substantial changes. So the substantial improvement criteria for 50%, having to elevate, that was already there. So we don't have to strengthen our ordinances at all. We just have to redo them again under the new standard template. So again, just to be clear, we're not making them more difficult, and we're not changing their content. We are simply changing their format because it was rejected by FEMA after all the hard work by the borough last year.
Okay, so in that conference, my question, which kind of worried me, was they were talking about getting permits for, let's say you want to redo your kitchen. Let's say you want only kitchen cabinets, and a kitchen is sometimes around $40,000 to $50,000. And they were saying that some of that kitchen work may have not been, you may not have needed a construction permit under, a permit to do it. But in this case, the FEMA requirements would require you to get a construction permit because it had to do with the increase in the value of the house, and it was confusing. And I think a lot of people were concerned about that.
Okay, that's another good question. The way it works is this: if you're doing improvements to your home and you live in a floodplain, this is what's interesting.
A floodplain or a floodway?
Either. It's no difference. Floodplain or floodway. If you do a substantial improvement, you have to elevate. So that's a FEMA requirement. So substantial improvement is a FEMA requirement. Okay. So I always say FEMA only looks at two lines. They look at floodplain, the floodplain line. Whether it's floodplain, floodway, the insurance is the same, and the requirements for substantial improvement are identical.
Okay.
And so the way it was presented was extremely confusing.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, a construction code official is not responsible every single time you put a new outlet or a new sink to monitor what you're doing. It's only during major construction that the code official will be looking at saying, okay, you're doing, for instance, a $50,000 repair. It is very likely you're going to need some sort of permit. You're moving electrical utilities, you're moving plumbing utilities, and that sort of thing. The little ones typically don't trigger substantial improvements. So it's, again, in fairness to the construction code official, no, it's just a major construction project that requires permits would ever be checked to see if you have a substantial improvement or not. And in the borough of Pompton Lakes, as in many towns in North Jersey, it's a 10-year look back. So what that prevents is, let's say every year I redo another room, and I go around my house.
And they were talking about that. Like, you want to do one room in this year and one room next year. Is that a collective then?
Yes, with a 10-year look back. So if over a 10-year period on a structure worth $300,000, you've done $190,000 of improvements, you're over the 50% threshold.
Right.
You need to elevate.
Who's going to make you do that?
Construction code official and the DEP. It'll be the construction code official, though.
Oh boy.
The first line of defense is always the construction code official, and then the second line is always DEP if they believe that we're not acting, and then the last is FEMA. The issue becomes if FEMA starts acting on behalf of the borough, it would get us kicked out of the CRS.
Right. That's correct. Right. So we don't want to lose our CRS for everybody else.
No. The cost to the residents will be over $250,000 per year in increased flood insurance premiums.
So as far as Pompton Lakes and this new, is it a new requirement from the DEP? Are we okay?
Yes. We have been doing this all along. And the code official has done a very good job of doing this all along, tracking improvements to structures. And every time when we get audited, which is every 3 years by FEMA, it is their finding that we are doing this.
Okay.
Which is, again, I give a lot of credit to the borough. You guys are doing a very good job.
And that's the cumulative, and that is for permitted work.
Correct.
So those of us who have gone through flood repairs are many of us are familiar with this, that if your cumulative repairs or improvements to your house that require permits over a 10-year period equal 50% of the value of your house, then it will trigger the need to elevate the next time when you hit that 50%.
Yes.
So yeah, a kitchen remodel can absolutely trigger
Mhm.
an elevation requirement, a roof, a hot water heater. So it's
But I will-
something to be aware of. Just, it's something that people who live in the floodplain need to be aware of that. And that's floodplain. That is not just floodway.
But I will say this, when it comes to a flood plain or floodway, if someone is going to put a tremendous amount of money into a home, it is typically a good idea to elevate anyway, because it's your asset. If you're dropping $150,000 in improvements on a structure in a floodplain, it is always in your best interest to elevate anyway. So that there's certain, I don't say this very often, but there's certain federal rules that do make sense. And that's one of them. It's, if you're going to put a tremendous amount of money into the structure, elevating, especially the elevation itself, might be a small percentage of how much you're going to spend to completely upgrade this home. You know, so.
And then
That's a
Nick,
thought.
Bill just asked again, is this a rolling 10-year period? That's a yes, right? It keeps resetting.
Yes.
The 10-year keeps moving.
Yep. Yeah. It's. We always say it's the window. This 10-year window keeps moving along, and then let's say your last major improvement was in 2009, and I'm going to do an improvement in 2021. Well, that's passed. Okay. And it would be my next improvement. I'd probably get compared to now. My next improvement would be like, okay, well, what'd you do in 2021? All right, I did another in 2026. Those two improvements. Let's take a look. Okay, you spent. And there are exceptions. There are things that I don't want to go into too much detail, but there are things that don't count toward that number. Okay, there are things you don't have to count toward that number, so bear that in mind as well. And I will say this, that for the most part, this doesn't get crossed. This threshold, substantial improvement. There are occasions, but it is not common for the threshold to get crossed. It does happen, but it's not common, and especially with a 10-year window, because people typically do it maybe every 20, do a major improvement on their home. I've been a homeowner in North Jersey for a long time, and yeah, it's maybe every 15 or 20, I'll do something big, and between that, I'll save my pennies up, you know, put them toward taxes, and the rest will go to my. It's so funny, Maria should mention. I like a kitchen. That's the one place I don't mind spending money is on the kitchen. Everything else,
Yeah.
yeah.
And bathrooms.
Yeah, bathroom. I can get by with like old outdated fixtures, but me and my three boys, we spend most of our time in the kitchen.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much. Great question.
If anybody on the attendee list, if you want to raise your hand, I can let you talk and open up. If not, please add to the chat or the Q&A box.
And Steve, I would like to mention, if anyone has follow-up questions they think of after this, especially after they look at their flood zone, please drop me an email. You just put in the subject line Q&A, and I'll look for those. Again, so in the subject line, just put Q&A if you email me, and right here at agnoli@agnolligroup.com, and I'm happy to answer the best I can.
And for the residents, just to know, Nick is a consultant who works for the borough. Just
Yep.
to close it in. He's not working on his own here. He works for the borough.
Yep. And again, I'm happy to answer questions, and I'll do what I can to advise you when it comes to improvements and that sort of thing. And I always check with the construction code official, so it's not that I give one answer and the borough's going to give a different answer. I work for the borough, and I work with the staff at the borough who are not only well versed at this stuff, but we work very well together. All right.
I don't see anything else. So.
All right, so thank you, Nick, very much. I know we had a slightly smaller group than we often have for your presentations. It's a little harder with Zoom, but we appreciate it very much.
You talk about floodplain management, and then they just all ran.